Okay, so as we continue on with 1900 to 1950, we had finished up with Matisse and started into Cubism. Now, the important thing to think about at this moment is that artists were exploring a way of abstracting the human body, right? In an interesting way, they had already mastered proportion. They had already mastered how to create a realistic, believable human body. And now artists were trying to create their own version of a human body, right? They were trying to recreate and reshape and reform the human body, often the female human body for a lot of these artists. So we come to Cubism, which was started by Picasso and another artist named Braque, who figured out that one way Matisse had kind of literally shaped a new version and simplified a new version of the body. Remember, this is the knife thrower. You can see on the left there's someone actually holding up a knife, and then to the right is the model who's holding up her arms, waiting to be, have him throw the knife, in between her arms, so to the right, to the left of her. He had simplified the shapes and reduced the colors. Well, see, what Picasso did was almost took the body like a Rubik's Cube and said, hey, why don't we twist it and shape it the same way as the Egyptians did, the same way as African masks did. And he was looking to a lot of older cultures. So anyway, so we have George Braque right here, who creates this piece that he's a landscape done in a cubist way, where he's figured out how to transform the houses, focusing on the underlying shape, the pattern. Here's another piece that I think is really nice of his. We'll just watch a little bit of this video. Let's see if it will open up. But I quite like this video, just a little bit of it.
We're in the Pompidou in Paris, and we're looking at a George Braque. It's an early Braque. It was painted just after Cézanne died. Braque went down to Vostok in almost a kind of homage, began to sort of work through Cézanne's style in his late paintings.
And you can see the viaduct that you see in many Cézanne paintings, and the same palette that you see in Cézanne, and that same kind of hatching brushwork that you see also in Cézanne. But things have changed. Braque has seen Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. The space is really compressed.
His meeting Picasso and seeing how Picasso is, in a sense, filtering Cézanne, not to mention other artists, including Matisse at this point, is having an impact here. It's these paintings that Braque is bringing back that Picasso sees that really pushes Picasso forward. You're talking about a compression. That bridge wants to be in the background, but it also pushes forward in some really aggressive ways, and the sky above it seems to push forward even more in some ways, so that the entire canvas seems to crest up and towards us.
And the buildings in the foreground seem to, in a way, crest up and back, so that the viaduct in the background and the houses, it feels like there's no middle ground.
Right, so how does he pull that off?
I see a lot of reduction to geometric forms. I see rectangles and triangles and pyramid shapes and semicircular shapes, almost as though the houses look like mountains and the mountains look like houses and the trees look like the sky. And it's hard not to see this through the lens of the dissolution of form that's going to happen with analytic cubism.
The colors are very much the colors of analytic cubism, grays and brown. You've got the gray blues up at the top, you've got the gray blues in the shadows down below, You've got those beiges and browns and reds throughout. There's real continuity across the surface of the canvas, just articulating the surface.
And you also have those kinds of eliding of forms that you see slightly later on in analytic cubism, where the roof, that horizontal roof there with the ochres and the golds in it, kind of slips down, if you follow the color, into another golden side of the roof. So there's no real distinction there in space. And also that way that you get sort of modeling with some black outlining, very much, again, analytic cubism.
So that kind of aligning of one form to another is something that's seen as a key characteristic of Cézanne and is often referred to in his work as passage, and the way in which it opens up the geometry of that structure. We were talking a moment ago about the nature of surface and the presence of surface here. And it's not just from the brushstroke, it's not just from the overall color, but it's also from the arbitrary. Look at the green brushstrokes on the center left, or look at the beige brushstroke that's in the upper right. These are reminders that we're looking at a two-dimensional surface, this refusal of space.
Mm-hmm. It almost feels a little bit to me like that's Braque's lesson from Fauvism. Those touches of paint that somehow can be separate from what he's representing too.
Right, but here color is not the vehicle.
Right. It's true.
Okay, so they went over a lot of things just there that I thought were interesting. I'm going to stop it right there. So what they said, one thing was, Fauvism was what Matisse did, right? But then they also said this refusal of space, right? So what they're talking about is these two marks right here. And they are very interesting because as you're looking at this painting and you're probably thinking to yourself, and as they're talking, you're thinking, okay, I'm starting to see how this shape goes into this shape and how these sort of work together to create this, this very interesting pattern. But then suddenly you're kind of reminded that it's all a surface because you have this one paintbrush and these few paintbrush strokes just hanging out right on the surface. So in a way, they're really breaking the myth that this is a space that you're looking into, right? That this is a window into another reality. They're reminding you that this is just a painting and nothing more. So that at the time was quite a radical thing to do. People were used to looking at artwork and thinking that it was a new world to explore. And now you have these, what they say, arbitrary marks, which means something that doesn't fit in, right? It doesn't seem necessary. They are unnecessary marks. They are there only because the artist, they're there not in relation to the landscape at all, right? They're in relation to the artist who's painting it and his decisions. So in a way, you are put in, when you're looking at this, you are put into the mind of the artist. Which brings me to something that I often do. These are two self-portraits by Picasso. And what I like to do when I go into a museum is I often like to look at the painting. I like to, well, first, let me just, I'll go to any, let me just fast forward to something. Okay. So let's say something like this, right? I usually, if I was to encounter this in a museum, I would walk up to it and I would, before looking at anything else, I would assess what I'm looking at. I would say, what am I looking at? Okay, I'm looking at a blue painting. It's got some sort of like yellowish colors, white colors, black colors, but it's all blue. There's multiple figures within the painting. There's a man and a woman. They're looking at another woman with a baby. And then there's a set of figures in the background, a set of figures at the bottom that I'm not sure if they're really there or maybe they're drawn onto another surface, right? Maybe they're like flat. So it's multiple figures. I usually will start to think about like, okay, what is it that I'm looking at? I'll think about how does it make me feel? Well, I mean, this personally for me makes me feel a bit melancholy. I mean, maybe it's the color, maybe it's the expressions on the faces. It seems sad and it seems sad, but it also seems like perhaps there's stages of a life going on. I mean, and because there's all these different ages, like the woman holding the baby looks a little older, and then the people in the back look perhaps like they're dying. And then I'll start to think about how did the artist paint this? How did the artist make this? Which I think is a really interesting way to approach art. Just how did they physically paint this? And I would start to wonder, why did they only choose blue, right? Why did they make the figures as big as they did? How did they paint this? Why is that middle bottom figure so roughly sketched out and not painted as finished looking as the rest. So as I start to think about that, I'll think about that for a little while, and then I'll look at the name on the wall, usually, and the title. This title is called Life, okay? The name is Pablo Picasso, and I'll be like, oh, okay, it's a Pablo Picasso, but it's not like, you know, all the ones that I've usually seen. So this must be some other period of his life. Then I'll look at the year, 1903. The year usually can tell me some information, you know, turn of the century, beginning of modern art. So those are all the ways that I approach art. And I think it's important to approach art that way, because then you start to think about, if you were looking at this piece, you would say, why did the artist put this here? Why did the artist put this here, right? And you might not be able to figure it out, okay? But if you can imagine it, it's a great way to appreciate artwork. Moving on. So this is 2 self-portraits done by Picasso. I just wanted to show you. So Picasso has many different phases. He went through a lot of different styles. This is Picasso in 1900 to the left. This is Picasso in 1907. Only 7 years. And he didn't just go through many different styles. He went through them quickly. Picasso was known as being a boy genius, basically. So when he did this piece, I think when he was like, I think about 16. There's artwork that, he has artwork that we have from 8 years old. And like most boy geniuses, like most child geniuses, you look at their parents and you can figure out why, right? So his dad was a professor of art and a teacher of art and an artist himself. And his father started teaching him at a very, very young age. He enrolled him in the Academy of Art at a very, very young age. And so Picasso started very young in the academic world. So this was an early piece of his. This is another early piece of his from 1895. So as you can tell, he had a lot of technical academic skill. So then, and I'm just going to go out here, you'll look at his wiki art, right? And you can see that he has, when you talk about isms, when you talk about all the different types of, you know, we have Cubism, Post-Impressionism, Expressionism, Primitivism, Analytical Cubism, which they mentioned in the video a little bit, Synthetic Cubism, synthetic just means physical, Neoclassicism, which we've covered, and we haven't covered Surrealism. So if you look at something like, he went through all these different styles, and not sure what's going on. I think this must be the browser, but let's look at this one. So this is one of his neoclassical styles. But as you can tell, he has a very unique way. I mean, this looks a little bit almost like what you might have seen around Miami, a Botero. I don't know who he is, but that's okay. But it looks Greek and Roman inspired, right? Sort of Greek and Roman inspired in a Picasso way. Now, this was done in 1920. So this was done far, far, far after the neoclassical style. But Picasso liked to mix, he had so many different styles and ways of working. Well, that's not neoclassical. So the one style that you're probably most familiar with is his Cubism style. So his Cubism style is the one that really set him apart from everybody else. So he had this way of creating artwork, creating figures that, unlike Matisse's almost look like boneless, right? These look as if they've been shattered, right? Like you took a photograph and you crumpled it up. So you're seeing all sorts of different planes of the body, different shades of the body. You're seeing, and you know, Matisse did accuse him of stealing. And Picasso said, you know, gosh, what did he say? Let me look it up, because I used to love this. Picasso stealing quote. I'll get it right. Widely quoted as, "Good artists borrow, great artists steal." So that's something that he, you know, has been reported as saying, because he did try so many different styles. His blue period is this one that I mentioned before, Life. And his blue period lasted, it was after a death of one of his friends. There's also some rumors that perhaps he was so poor that he was gifted a bunch of paint, but mainly in the blue realm, so that's all he could work with. People thought he was just melancholy, but his blue period lasted for long, where he just only worked in blue. He loved to experiment with different trials. This is one's called the absinthe drinker. And you can see he's deliberately making choices, right? We know that he can paint like this. So why is he choosing to paint like this, right? Why is he choosing to make her hand bigger? One reason is he wants you to focus on this hand. He wants you to see the elongation of the arms. He wants you to look at her face. Absinthe was an alcohol that was supposed to have wormwood in it, which was a hallucinogen. So he wants to make you look at her and think that perhaps she is under the influence of this alcoholic hallucinogen. This one is about the stages of life, and the piece that's in those two in the background are supposedly paintings. And the one in the bottom has been found to be, is supposedly rumored to be a lost painting of Picasso's. So in the background are two paintings, two drawings that he's done. And then these are two people, very much like Adam and Eve, who are looking at an older woman. So it's sort of a life cycle. This is his portrait of Gertrude Stein. She was a very famous art collector. So Gertrude and Leo Stein had a collection of art that attracted artists to their house. They're one of the first patrons of progressive modern artists. Basically, they were some of the first people to actually buy artwork by Picasso and his peers and Matisse, because this wasn't popular artwork. This was avant-garde artwork. So they had to have some sort of buyers. So they became friendly with the artists. They invited over the artists. They had a bunch of artwork. And so the artists would go over to their house to see their work. They introduced Picasso and Matisse to each other. Gertrude had weekly salons, so basically weekly shows in her studio apartment. And she commissioned this portrait by Picasso. She posed up to 90 times, but this looks nothing like her. He actually replaced her face with the face that he had gotten from an Iberian statue. Iberian sculpture. So if we look at what Iberian sculptures look like, these are from an ancient civilization, right? So what Picasso did wasn't new. What he created wasn't new. What he figured out was, hey, I'm going to look at these older cultures and see that they simplified faces, right? They create, even Egyptians, right? Egyptians created these simplified faces. And then Picasso said, I am going to copy these older ancient cultures. So Picasso replaced her face, and he also combined it with his academic painting style, right? So he says, okay, I'm going to replace this piece, just her face, but then you'll be able to see my academic training in the rest of her body, which will provide an interesting juxtaposition. So here's some key terms really quickly, just so I've said this word avant-garde several times, but I'll continue. Avant-garde is any artwork that is at the forefront of innovation, right? It challenges accepted values, traditions, techniques. It tends to be the artwork that is the most unpopular in public, right? The one that is the weirdest, the strangest, something that people might even say is not art. That would be considered the avant-garde. A patron is any organization or individual who sponsors the creation of works of art. And they are very important to the avant-garde, especially because Most artists that work in the avant-garde are not going to be selling their work to a mass public audience. So they have to have wealthy benefactors who will pay for the creation of artworks that most people don't like, right? So that is a very tricky thing. And a salon is a routine gathering of a circle of notable people, often figures from the world of art, literature, and politics, at home of one member of the group. There actually is a salon that I went to in Miami. These are held still to this day, where we would just show up once a week and show each other our artwork. That's all we did. And we would discuss it. So it's a good way of seeing what kind of work is out there. Anyway, so just to go back to some other Picassos that I would like to talk about. So yes, there's Cubism. Naive art was called Primitivism. This is probably some of the artwork that you've seen as well, a lot of. So Primitivism is basically making work that looks like primitive cultures, or what would be considered primitive cultures in that time. It's a term that we don't like anymore. But creating work that harkens back to other forms of art. So I keep on saying African masks. If you look at African masks, which Picasso collected and which also were collected wildly in France, you can see they reduced the faces in African masks, and also they put patterns on the faces, right? So they have these beautiful, complicated patterns in traditional African masks, and these reduction of forms, right? These big circle eyes, these flat areas that are just there, these cutouts. Picasso basically did the exact same thing with his faces. But then he would combine them with an academic level technique. So here is a very famous piece of his, and I do also like the Khan Academy version of this. So we will go to them briefly as well.
We're on the 5th floor of the Museum of Modern Art looking at Demoiselle d'Avignon by Pablo Picasso.
Picasso is a Spanish artist, but he's in Paris when he paints this. The title translates to The Young Ladies of Avignon,
which refers to a street that's not in France but is in Barcelona and associated with prostitution. What we're looking at is a brothel. The idea of rendering a woman who is available to the male viewer, but within a context that goes back to Degas, but it also goes back to Manet if you think about his painting Olympia. And you could go even further back to the Venetian Renaissance and look at paintings by Titian.
For many art historians, this painting is seen as a break with the 500 years of European painting that begins with the Renaissance.
And many art historians see this as the foundation on which Cubism is built.
So it's this radical break that points to the future. And it's a radical break with these conventions of representation that had for so long been accepted in the West about how you make a body in space, how you create a space. All of that is upended by Les Demoiselles d'Avignon.
Gone is linear perspective. Gone is chiaroscuro, that modulation of light and shadow that creates the illusion that Picasso, by the way, was in love with, the magic of illusion. But here he's shattering it.
He found the formal means to convey the ideas, I think, that were behind Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Ideas about sexuality, about the female nude, about sexually transmitted diseases. This is a confrontational painting.
In the original sketches, the women were focusing on a male that was included, a sailor. There was also a medical student. But he takes those men out, and the women then turn their gaze outward, like Manet's Olympia, to engage us, the viewer, directly.
Those two male figures give us a clue to some of the ideas behind the painting. A sailor, someone who's in a brothel as a customer, who was seated at a table originally.
And then the medical student takes on a more analytical view, who looks at the women from a more scientific perspective, but also maybe from a more artistic perspective. Artists have a history of dissecting human bodies, of understanding the bone structure, the musculature, of looking at the body analytically.
But let's not forget that that medical student carried, at least in some sketches, a skull. And of course it makes sense that a medical student studying anatomy might be carrying something related to his profession to tell us who he is. On the other hand, the skull in art history is a reminder of death. It's a memento mori. And so there seems to be some tension here between the sensuality that the sailor is indulging in and a moralizing reminder that the pleasures of life are short, indicated by the skull carried by the medical student.
The faces of the women on the right are often seen as representations of African masks that we know Picasso was then looking at. The figure on the left is an archaic figure going back to ancient Spain, going back to Iberian art before the classical period.
That's one of the problems of this painting. We look at art and we expect stylistic coherence, but here we have this agglomeration of styles.
It's a kind of invention. Picasso is allowing his laboratory to be exposed to us. There is a physical confrontation. There is danger here.
The figures are really close to us. Space has become this palpable three-dimensional fractured planes.
The curtains that seem to thread in between the figures are pressed right up against those figures. There is no space behind or between. There is still some sense of illusion. There's still some shadow. There's still some highlighting. But Picasso has only created an illusion that goes back into space a few inches. It's a little bit difficult to look at this painting without the hindsight of understanding where Cubism is going to go. But knowing that Cubism is this deconstruction of three-dimensional form, shattering that form, and then placing those fragments back on a two-dimensional surface has led some art historians to look at the central figure as one that we're both looking across at, but also looking down at, as if we're standing over her while she lies on a bed. These were not ideas that Picasso came up with independently. Matisse had been exploring these ideas, and before him, Cézanne had done this.
You can see why artists who saw this painting in Picasso's studio soon after it was painted were horrified. Even Degas, when he represented unidealized women in a brothel, never came close to the rawness, the ugliness.
Picasso is a product of his culture. He's a product of this moment. The fact that he's looking at African masks in order to represent danger is an expression of France's colonialism. Those objects, those masks, were coming to France because France had large colonial possessions in Africa. And Picasso at this time knew very little about the cultures that these came from. He was interested in them for their formal qualities, for their formal inventiveness, also because they represented otherness.
This idea of needing to go outside the Western tradition in order to express what the early 20th century and the late 19th century felt like is important. This tendency toward expressing the flatness of the picture plane, not denying it by creating this false illusion. This is a very important thing in the late 19th and early 20th century.
It speaks to the oppressiveness with which post-Renaissance culture, Mannerism, the Baroque, Neoclassicism, the academies of the 19th century, all weighed on contemporary artists who are seeking a new visual language to represent modern culture.
So that was very quick, but they went over a lot of important things about Picasso. And I think about, his use of African masks. Yeah, he did not necessarily know that all the history of colonialism that we do now. And when they talk about the word otherness, what they're meaning is the concept of otherness is basically anything that identifies a person or a human being that is different from your inner self. So it's a concept of otherness in post-colonialism, after colonialist times, is stigmatizing people as barbarians, savages, people of color, relegating people to something that you can be dominant over. Now, we also know that Picasso had many, many, many issues with women. He was notorious for being a womanizer. He had many girlfriends, many issues, and so yes, there's a lot of complicated history with Picasso when it comes to racism and sexism. And Especially nowadays in the Me Too era, there's been a lot of talk about what will happen to his legacy now that we know about all these different things and we're looking at him with a different light. Picasso has sold quite a lot of art, right? So if you look at just his work right here, you can also see his auction prices, which are insane. This piece right here, Les Films d'Algiers, you don't really need to see this, but $179 million. It was bought for $179 million. This piece right here, $115 million. $106 million. $95 million. So incredibly high prices will have gone to Picasso. Now, art is only worth what people believe it's worth, right? But it could also be worth, and I'm just going to go over here really quickly, there is also, some worth, that's not Picasso, in something that's a political statement. So this is another video. I know I'm showing a lot of videos today, but I like this one as well, just to show that he didn't do everything for money, because Picasso has become so symbolic of high record prices, right? Auction prices, that sometimes it's easy to forget that he also made work that isn't symbolic of finances.
Picasso's Guernica, the most powerful anti-war statement in 20th century art.
In her opinion.
Painted in 1937, in response to the deliberate bombing of civilians in the Basque town of Guernica by Nazi warplanes during the Spanish Civil War, it shows writhing, agonized figures trapped in the horror of the bombardment. A mother clutches her baby. A soldier lies dead, partly dismembered. A bull and a horse, the artist's emblems of his native Spain, rage wounded across the giant canvas. Tongues are replaced by swords in screams of agony. Picasso created the work for the Paris Expo of that year. He read the news of the Guernica atrocity in April and immediately set to work at a furious pace, finishing the enormous mural, almost 8 meters long, in just 35 days. His palette of matte blacks, whites and greys not only conveys the bleak horror of his subject matter, but echoes the news photos of the time, as well as the photographic work of his then lover, Dora Maar, who documented the making of the work in a series of intense images. Guernica was a rare piece of public art for Picasso, and after its display in Paris, it set off on an international tour, showing all over Europe, America and elsewhere for many years, in support of the artist's dream of a free and democratic Spain. Yet despite its specific subject matter, the work stands as a statement about all wars. So powerful is it that during the Vietnam War, it was defaced in New York's Museum of Modern Art by a protester. A tapestry copy of Guernica hangs in the United Nations building in New York, outside the room where the Security Council meets, and forms the backdrop to many dignitaries' speeches. It's said that it was covered by a curtain for the announcement of the Iraq War by General Colin Powell in 2003. Whether or not that is true, it's surely the ultimate testament to the painting's power. Picasso, who never returned to live in Spain after his self-imposed exile in 1934, stipulated in his will that Guernica should not go back to Spain until democratic rule was re-established in his homeland. 2 years after his death in 1973, Franco himself died, and the mighty canvas found its final permanent home in Spain in 1981. Now in a specially curated exhibition at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid, exactly 80 years after its creation, it seems as relevant as ever.
So you can see, by the way, the powerful issue of scale.
The news
One of the
photos
reasons why I think that everyone should actually physically go to a museum is look at the scale of this piece. It's so much larger than you think it is. And the other interesting thing about Picasso is he did live for so long and in a time when there was so much photography that we can actually see him creating artwork, which is amazing. So just one last piece of Picasso's before we move on. Like a lot of things, we could talk about it for ages. So this is what's called analytical cubism. Analytical cubism is an even more fractured version of cubism. And like they mentioned in Guernica, there was this reference to photography and also reference to newspapers, right? Reference to mass culture. Picasso was one of the first artists who worked with collage. So collage is cut and pasted work. So basically you would take like a magazine, you would take a newspaper, and you would cut things out and then glue them onto another surface, right? We're all very familiar with it. We probably did it when we were kids. At that time, it was completely new and very radical. Remember when I said that Degas got into a lot of trouble because he put on a real tutu onto a sculpture? Well, this was exactly the same thing. Picasso cut out newspapers. He cut out this wine bottle label and put it on to this other surface. And he didn't make it himself. This was very radical. People were very shocked by this, right? He used an actual real bottle label. So this was a later phase of Cubism, and collage was basically sort of invented, at least on a two-dimensional level, by Picasso, even though it was worked with three-dimensional level by Degas. I'm going to stop there for right now to keep these videos a little bit shorter, and I'll pick up